I felt like every time I got up, I'd get up and then I'd start walking and maybe start running, and then like somebody would kick my feet back out from under me. And I kept going because none of those places along the way were anywhere I had any interest in staying.
What if story is the answer to our crises of meaning and belonging, to our impulse to heal our lives and help others, to our desire and drive to leave this world better than we found it? Now, we love good stories. In fact, we're kind of obsessed, not just with the stories themselves, but with the stories behind the stories. Their oddly perfect timing, the healing process they provoke in their authors, and their capacity to catalyze individual and collective change. And we love exploring these with writers, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, healers, parents, and others. Tune in to hear these stories behind the stories and entertain with us the real possibility that whether you are a teller or a consumer, story is always offering or leading us to an answer. When Michelle Ann Collins was prompted to write a book about losing her partner to suicide, she responded like any sane person would. She scoffed. And then she eventually surrendered to what she knew would be a healing opportunity. It hasn't been easy, and the road has been long, but it has been worth it. Tune in to hear how Michelle overcame a devastating loss and PTSD to the point of being able to help others who are facing similar pain. You'll find out how she sustained herself and actually built resilience through the process of revisiting extremely traumatic moments as she wrote her story. And you'll learn how she's bringing an extremely important conversation and tools to a culture that is absolutely illiterate when it comes to grief. It's that time. Grab a cup of something yummy and a pen so you can capture every sip of story and sanity. All right, welcome to Sips of Story and Sanity, where we talk about the stories behind the stories with authors, speakers, thought leaders, healers, parents, and more. My team, son Aaron, who can't be here today, but sister Alyssa is.
Hello.
And of course, my clients turned friends, turned team members, Teddy.
Hiya.
And Lori.
Hi, everyone.
Are here to make sure that we get the most delicious sips of story and sanity out of this conversation. So today we have Michelle Ann Collins, who is an international best-selling author, certified yoga therapist, grief educator, Ayurvedic lifestyle teacher, Reiki master, and wellness coach. After suffering a series of heartbreaking losses, including her mother to cancer, her divorce, and her second husband to suicide, Michelle immersed herself in the healing arts. She now shares the tools she developed along her journey, teaching that post-traumatic growth is possible and that everyone, no matter what they've experienced, can live a fulfilling and joyful life. When she isn't writing or teaching, Michelle can be found hiking the Oregon forests or paddleboarding on the rivers near her home. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Amanda and Lori and Alyssa and Teddy. Good to see everyone.
Yeah, it's fun because we get to hang out together at least once a week, working on all of the content. So it's fun to be in this space with you.
Yeah.
Where we get to put the spotlight on you and your journey. Of course, I had to ask you to be part of the book You Can't Make This Story Up, because we have had many of those moments.
And they continue even this week.
Yes, I don't know if you'll be sharing about that, but holy moly, that was a big one. So I mean, I would love to start at the beginning. You obviously have a career in wellness. And so what was it that got you thinking about needing to put some of your expertise on paper?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually had, before all these tragedies in my life sent me on a really strong, intense growth trajectory. I had planned on putting out a series of books with a bunch of different names that I came up with at the time, but it was going to be Follow the Yellow Brick Road, the Yellow Book Road to Enlightenment. And I was picturing these little yellow books, and starting with the first book would be about physical, because that's where I started. I was a gymnast when I was a little kid, and then I was a dancer. And, you know, as things broke down, I would find exercises that I could do because my body just was not meant for long-term competition. And so I ended up in yoga, and my life really changed because it was the first really sort of slow, mindful movement exercise that I did. And I realized the importance of it, and I wanted to share that journey with people. So I had that book going before I met my second husband, and life took a turn.
It did. So you had the book going. What do you think was the reason why you didn't move that forward? Was it because life changed and you were getting married and just too many other things going on?
Yeah, when I met Glenn, it really shook things up. As much as you can have your life shake up and still be alive, all of that happened. And it was all about, I mean, our whole marriage was putting out fires. When we first got married, he has 3 kids, I have 3 kids, and the merger did not go smoothly at all. Most of the kids were teenagers at the time, and it was a mess. So there wasn't any time for something like writing. It was just immediately, you know, extinguishing fires, and not a time to be writing. I would journal sometimes just for my own mental health, but certainly not in a creative space to share healing stories with the world.
Right. Yeah. And so then everything happened. I mean, you got married and this horrible tragedy happened. And at what point after everything happened with Glenn did you start to think that maybe you were in a place where you could begin to share what was getting you through that?
Well, therapeutically, I had been writing probably since just a few months after he died, just because that's a way, since I remember doing this way back, even in college, when I was really upset about something, I would write it out, just write the story, and to release some of that pressure. And so when I had started writing stories about the different things that happened, you know, you'd think it's bad enough that my husband died by suicide, but all the fallout, all the challenges with his ex-wife and his children and the estate. And I mean, it just seemed like every time I took a step forward, I would fall down a giant hole and, you know, no progress. And so I wrote a lot of these stories because it would kind of entertain me and make me see it from a little bit different perspective, and just bring a tiny bit of light into this really dark space. And then a year after he died, when I went to spread his ashes in Maui off of a beach where we had spent some fun time snorkeling. I immediately after I did the ceremony, I really got a message from the universe, is the best way I can describe it. It was one of those events that you hear about, God talking to you, or maybe it was my inner self. I mean, I didn't try to name the voice at the time, but it was a very clear message that said, you have to write a book about surviving your spouse's suicide. And so that's when I started pursuing that book specifically.
And what was your initial reaction to that? Because, you know, I hear a lot of people get inspirations to write and they have a myriad of responses. I can't imagine that one was like really enthusiastic.
No, it was like a combination of horror and nausea. I was horrified. The idea of writing a book like that just it terrified me. I felt like I had absolutely no expertise to write a book like that. I didn't want to talk about it. Death and grief are hard enough to talk about when the death is an expected death, or sort of what our the thing that we all aspire to, right? You die in your sleep at an old age with all your family around you, after having lived a fulfilling, perfect life, right? That's the death we all sort of think of. And even those are really, really challenging for loved ones. You feel grief and loss, and it's really hard. So most deaths, unfortunately, are not the death we would all aspire to. And so to talk about that meant I was going to sit in that story, and it's a really painful place to be. So yeah, that my first response was something along the lines of, hell no, that's an awful idea.
Yeah.
But as I write in my chapter in our upcoming book, or maybe it's out, I don't know when this podcast is gonna air, but January 21st, when our book comes out, I talk about that, how I transitioned from hell no to okay, I'll do it.
So this was only a year after this tragedy had happened. And so where were you in the grief process at this point? I can't imagine that, because like you said, it wasn't just losing him that way. It was all the other crap that you had to deal with. To me, that would be like compounding trauma, or not allowing the grief process to even start, because you'd have to keep functioning. So where were you at in the?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what happens when you're in acute grief is you really don't know where you are. You don't have the awareness, oh, okay, I'm only a year in, and I am on step 6 of 247. You don't have that awareness. And as you know, it's not a linear process. I mean, you might have a good day, and then a bad day, and then a great day, and then 2 really terrible days. And I was still in the midst of estate hell. The estate didn't close for almost a year after that. So it took almost 2 years to get all that straightened out. And I really was, I would say, avoiding probably a good 70-80% of my grief at that time. After he died, I developed PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was just really starting to move through that with the help of a wonderful trauma therapist. So I was very, very far from having a perspective and being through the story enough to actually be able to share it a year out.
So you kind of knew that it was going to be either extremely painful or therapeutic, or both, because you'd had that experience of writing. So what was that process like? I mean, it was another full year before we met, right?
Right. Yes. And I did, after I got that message from the universe, I did start to write some of the basic outline for the book. And it felt good. It felt good to write it and to sort of take a step out of the story to look at the story from the outside. And it started to move some things, which I think is one of the most important things about writing story, is that it can be so therapeutic. And so it really did help me to start writing those things and to think of, and this is something David Kessler teaches. He taught the grief educator certification I took, and he worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So he's pretty much a world-renowned expert in grief and loss. And he just had a book come out. This was later in the process for me, but last year, called Finding Meaning. Maybe it was 2 years ago now. I don't know. COVID made a year blur, like more than a year of just blur time. And what his thesis is, that meaning, until you find meaning, you really haven't fully grieved, and that is a way to heal. finding meaning. That doesn't necessarily mean finding meaning in the death itself. It means finding meaning in your own life, or in the love that you experienced, or some experiences that you had with your loved one. So thinking about writing this book was healing for me, and starting the process of writing the book was healing for me in that way, because all of a sudden it gave Glenn's death and my experience of it meaning, purpose. So it was really therapeutic in that way. It gave me almost a light at the end of the tunnel. Like there's something more than just this tragedy in my life. And so I did hire a book coach soon after I got that message, and I worked with her for a summer. And I honestly can't remember why it didn't work out. It was so long ago, and there were so many other things. I think I was writing such great poetry, and I was writing all this other stuff, and I just couldn't write the book itself. And I think it's very clear now looking back. So that was more than 4 years ago. It just wasn't ready to be written.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are those layers, I mean, even looking at some of the other people who are in You Can't Make This Story Up and looking at their process, there is always a therapeutic element. And what I've learned is to not try to turn the thing into something, like to hold it to this idea that we have for it so intensely that we lose what's trying to happen. So, we have like someone who is writing a fiction and who can, not see that she's literally writing her own life in the fiction. And as a coach, I can see it, but I can say, hey, do you notice that these stories that you're telling over here are connected? Like I can try to make those connections, but until a person is ready, then, they don't see it. And so I've seen all of these different, ways that we therapize ourselves through the process of writing. And I think it's so cool that you had a journal practice before that you knew was therapeutic. But that's one of the things that we talked about earlier is like, part of this is you just got to kind of like write it raw. You just got to almost, a good book coach will tell you, you have to write it for your reader, not for yourself. But I will say that, and then I'll say, unless you got to write it for yourself first, and then you write it for yourself first. Tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help you God, and then
get it out. Yeah.
Because the honesty around the details is part of witnessing healing, witnessing what actually happened. Because, I'm sure you could share a lot about what happens in the brain as a result of a tragedy like this, where there are just some things that you push away so that you cannot see them anymore, right?
Yeah, you have to disconnect, because you can't feel that much all at once. You have to take little sips to work your way through. Yeah, and you helped me so much with the writing part, as far as just, I would try to step into the reader's shoes, and but I, and you just kept, just write the story, Michelle, just write the story. And that was so helpful. And I think one of the things that helped the most about that was your shitty rough draft. Like, just write the shitty rough draft. Because, I don't know if I can't speak for other writers, but I edit as I go, and I want the first draft to be like this perfect project. And it's
nobody, wait, nobody
Oh.
here understands that, right?
No.
Right?
They're all
shaking their heads
yeah.
and grinning.
But it's almost like trying to it almost like narrows the outlet, so you can't really just get all that out, because you're sort of filtering it on the way out. And what you need to do is just get it out, and then you can edit it, or even better, you can get somebody else to edit it. So you don't even have to go back through and go through all of that. But it's and that helped me get the point of it being therapy. Even though I was writing to write a book, I was still writing the stories as therapy. And a lot of them, once you started looking at my work, and you would be like, well, let's just take that out. And I think one of the best things I could do is just let it go. When you said, well, I think that's a little off track, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, whatever you said about some of this stuff. And some of them were big chunks of writing, like whole pages or 2 pages. And they would go in the extra file at the bottom of, the document. And I didn't realize at the time that nothing ever returns from that dungeon. But it's a place of permanent exile. But the process of writing was incredibly helpful. And, writing begets writing. So once you're on a roll and you're writing, it just kind of flows. And so, yeah, I think being able to let go of those things that you put in the dungeon was a big skill that I think it's important for writers to have, to be able to not cling once it's out, but know that it's out and it'll end up where it's supposed to be.
Yeah. And truly, some of it really is just for therapeutic purposes, right? Like there are details that wouldn't matter, or there are things that we write about. I know for me, where I'll write where you can hear me putting words in someone else's mouth or feelings in someone else's body in the experience, because I'm making all the assumptions. So, but when I do it like that, then it makes it sound true to the reader, as if I've talked to that person and said, yeah, that was what you're thinking. No, that was just my perception. So we have to, adjust these things, especially in cases like this, where you weren't the only one experiencing such a tremendous amount of trauma, right? Like there were so many other people connected to you who were part of this story, part of your healing journey, where there were some real sensitivities that, again, that editing factor. Do I just like not talk about it and not include it? Or do I, write it raw and then adjust it? I mean, it can be so tricky with those things.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And when people ask me, because now I have 2 books published, when people ask me, how did you do it? And I always just say, just write, just get it out and then edit, then worry about which part's going to help people and which part's just therapeutic for you.
Yeah. Well, I know that this wasn't the writing process was just one part of the process, as is the case for these therapeutic phases in our lives, right? Like, I mean, in some ways it's like, really? And in other ways, I'm just always grateful when there's affirmation that there are other things being put in my path to try to help the process. So even though sometimes they're just so shitty, I mean, just terrible. So
all in the name of growth.
All in the name of growth, right? So it feels like trauma, but it's actually gearing towards growth. So I would love for you to share, some of those moments, like the extra outside of the writing process stuff that was really helping you to dig in, and really, from where I stood, it was really about you witnessing how much work you had already done, and seeing how strong and resilient you already were. Because when you're writing about those stories, you're back in that place of like pain and hopelessness. You're tapping all those little neurons, right? Those pathways. So, I'd love for you to share as much as you're willing to.
Yeah, sure. I'm just trying to think of what the best way to go with that question is, because there's so many. Just to, a lot of it I talk about in the chapter, and I don't know if you want me to repeat stuff that I wrote in there, but for example, when I met Amanda at a workshop that she was giving for aspiring authors. The name of it's in the chapter. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but something about being a messenger. And I found the workshop at a very perfect time where I just knew, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. I went in there and we were going through some, exercises and talking about our stories. And I grabbed you during break and told you that I'm trying to write a book about suicide loss survival. And I can barely even talk about suicide loss survival. Now, keep in mind, this was over 4 years, going on 4 years ago. So about 3.5 years ago. And I was still not anywhere near ready. So this was 2 years after Glenn died. The story was not ready to be written. But what you did for me was you reacted like a, book publisher or book coach would, and that is great. Let's see, let's do it. And most people, when you mention suicide or suicide loss or anything about that, and it's not just suicide, it's any sudden early death. People, because our society is so grief illiterate, people don't know how to respond to your grief, and they don't know how to internally respond to it. So there's a lot of saying the wrong thing, or I shouldn't say wrong, the not helpful thing. And then they feel bad and you feel bad. And it's all just lack of education, which is why I became a grief educator, to help people with that. So when you leaned in, and then you had me tell my story to the group of aspiring authors that were there at the workshop, I realized, okay, this is not going to be a horror story. This is not going to be a Stephen King novel. This is going to be something that the people who need it will seek it out, and it will help them. And that really made a huge difference for my progress.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that you mentioned, you've mentioned it before to me, but also I think you talk about a little bit in the chapter, is something that I experience a lot of messengers experiencing, which is why I want to bring it up, which is the empathy. So especially when someone's experiencing trauma and hasn't completely repaired, it's kind of like having a very intense level of hypersensitivity to all the things, right? And so that makes us really good at some things. It makes us really good at figuring out where people are and meeting needs and helping and knowing what they need to hear. But it also makes it kind of awful to talk about our own hard stuff that we know makes them feel a certain way, because we can feel it when we're saying it. And so, as an empath, I know that you were struggling with that. It wasn't just, the people responding with not helpful things. It was your experience of their visceral emotion, right?
Yeah.
That was kind of like, how can I even, but that's all part of that resilience building process that happens through the process of writing, right? It's like, I can be here.
When you're used to telling the story, when you get to the point, and this for me was trauma therapy and writing, when you get to the point where you could talk about what you've been through in a way that, and you're able to stay embodied, keep your nervous system calm, it actually makes it so the person you're talking to also can stay more calm. There's a phenomenon called interpersonal neurophysiology. That's not the right word, but yeah. Your nervous system and their nervous system can sync up if you're really, close and having an intimate conversation. So if you get upset, they get upset. And it's not just empaths, but what I learned was two things. One is the first one I just said, when you're calm, when I stay calm, and when I keep if I burst into tears, well, they're gonna, but if I can talk about it and say, yeah, it was really, really hard. And so now I can help other people with hard things. It doesn't take those people to that place that it used to before I had done all the work that I've done. And the second thing that I've learned over my journey is I am not responsible for how anybody else feels. Their feelings don't necessarily come from anything I'm saying or doing. Now, if I punch you in the face, Amanda, sure, you're going to feel like pain in your face and probably wonder why the heck I punched you in the face. Something overt like that. But if I'm just telling my story and somebody has a bad reaction to it, their feelings are not my responsibility. And as an empath, that's probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to learn. I don't make anyone feel anything. But at the same time I learned that, I also learned I'm responsible for my feelings. My feelings aren't because of something you just said to me. They are my reaction to what you just said to me. And it's ongoing. It's a practice.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And the writing
that's one of the most, go ahead.
The writing does help with that, doesn't it? Like help you to kind
Absolutely.
of sort through what was mine, what was theirs.
Exactly. Just like you were saying a few minutes ago about putting words in their mouth, putting feelings in their body. You don't do that. Those words are in their mouth. Those feelings are in their body. Those are their responsibility. So yeah. And if you're writing and you're realizing, I mean, that's another way to strengthen that, your understanding of that boundary. Where do I stop and you start? Is when you're writing story, you can see it. It's almost like you're drawing a map of it. And you can see, okay, I just stepped into that other person's circle. That's outside the scope of my feelings and my responsibility.
Yeah. Which I think is one of the reasons why, the most therapeutic experience I see with clients is when they're really willing to step back into the character's experience, like that moment in time that they're writing about and experiencing it from the inside. But I think that that's necessary in order to do that work that you're talking about, to see where they end and another person begins. Because if you just tell the story, it's so much easier to just tell the assumptions with the story. And, rather than, if I'm committed to my own perspective, my thoughts that were happening, my feelings, then it becomes so blatantly obvious. It just will like come up and slap a reader in the face when you step out of that and start telling someone else's story, really.
Yeah. And I think the really important thing there is the self-responsibility, the taking responsibility for your story. This is my story. And you write it out and then you process the feelings about it.
Yeah. What were some of the challenges? Because, we started in 2018, right? That was the year that we had our epic retreat, which I kind of feel like we need to let that be a read experience for viewers.
Oh, good. I'm more than happy to let people read about that and not talk about it. I figured you were going to have me talk about it, and I'm fine if you want me to. But
let's do a quick hyper summary. The summary is, we had a few people at this retreat. Before the retreat, I saw these really bizarre connections happening, like names that were similar and patterns of abuse and experience that were similar. And I remember hanging up the phone and thinking, wow, this is either going to be an unbelievably magical experience for everyone, or it's going to be a nightmare. And it was a nightmare. It was.
And because it was my first retreat,
right,
and only, a little more than 2 years out from losing Glenn, I didn't know.
Right.
I mean, I knew I was having an awful experience, but I didn't know that retreats that you offered retreats that could feel supportive. So I figured And hopefully you're talking a lot
I'm like,
about those.
truly, like I've been, by this point, I've been doing this for 8 years. I've never had, I've had uncomfortable moments and conversations and things, obviously, because that's part of everyone telling their story. But I never experienced anything like this, where even I had a level of lack of safety that was hard to manage, even with all of my skills and tools, let alone try to do that with other people in the room, or,
Yeah. Can you
So
imagine, like, thinking about it now that I've written it all out and you've written your part and it's in this book that's coming out next month? It's just like, okay, it's another one of those growth stories. It happened to be a rapid growth. And
Mhm.
what I was thinking, I don't know if I was thinking it clearly at the time, but it is okay, just like the compounded difficulties that I had, Glenn's death, the aftermath, all, just, and it wasn't even just Glenn's death, it was everything that led up to that.
Right.
It's not like we had this smooth sailing easy ride and then all of a sudden he just decided to take his life one day. That's not what happened. I mean,
Right.
it was a couple years of
Nightmares.
really, yeah. And so it's kind of like, okay, I fell down the hill and then I went to go get up and someone stepped on my back and held me down and said things that weren't nice to me, whatever, image you want to use. And so I felt like, oh, this is just another example of, here I am trying to write my story, really open. I mean, when you write your story, you're in a very vulnerable place. I remember just typing and crying into the keyboard, and having to turn my head so that I wouldn't, drown my computer. And then to be in an unsafe environment
Mhm.
when I step away from the keyboard. And I was thinking, oh, more, just more
Yeah.
difficulty, more challenge.
Yeah. And, in the moment, as we're talking about self-responsibility, that for me was a defining moment in my coaching career, I'll say, because I realized how much responsibility I had been taking for everyone else's safety. And here you are having this experience, which everyone can feel, and yet, like, no one could make you safe except you. And you had the tools to do it. You were doing it in front of me. You were still, you know,
I
completing all
did,
of
but they
your
were not very sharp yet. They were baby tools. I'm so glad I could
Yeah.
be part of a defining moment of your coaching career. That's
Yeah.
that's that's a gold star I might actually offer back. You know what I mean? Like, I
Here, you can
could
have
have
this.
gone.
It's covered in some stuff.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
know.
Little sprinkles.
It's hard, but that's why we had to put it, and you can't make this story up. That's why
Yeah.
I asked Michelle to be part of it, because the healing goes both ways. And so, someone steps into my space with a level of trauma that I have not experienced. And I go, I wonder what I'm going to learn here. And then the first retreat happens and I go, oh, all right, that's what I'm going to learn here. Right. Of course, it's all about safety, because that was the thing that you needed the most. And, um, you know, it was just, what a ride, what a ride. So yeah, people will
It was.
have to finish reading that in our chapter. But so we finish this crazy retreat and we decide, you decide to keep writing and keep moving through the process. So what were some of the other challenges that you faced along the way?
Well, it just seemed to I just keep stumbling. I felt like I just had, so soon after the retreat, my brother was very ill in the hospital. He was in the ICU for over 2 weeks. And he lives in Arizona, and I went down and, if you've ever been, hospital bedside, uh, to a relative, you know that it takes every ounce of energy and focus that you have. And there's nothing, you leave it all there and in the hospital. Um, and so that also took me back to when I spent so much time with my mom in the hospital when she was dying from leukemia. Um, so it was a really tough couple weeks for me, and then time to recover from that. And then, oh my gosh, I had a series of health issues, and I'm a very healthy, health conscious person, right? That's what I write about, health. And kept running into these walls where I struggled with some physical things. I struggled. Now, my personal philosophy is it's all connected, mind, body, spirit. I was so out of alignment, and I struggled with depression, and then I struggled with anxiety, and of course PTSD is still sort of this noise underneath everything. And menopause and COVID, and they're just, I felt like every time I got up, I'd get up and then I'd start walking and maybe start running, and then like somebody would kick my feet back out from under me. And I kept going because none of those places along the way were anywhere I had any interest in staying. I knew that I could feel better, and that in my commitment to feeling better would then be able to get where I am today, which is in a situation where I can be there for others. I can, I'm a peer mentor for TAPS, which is Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. It's a military service that anyone who died in the military, it supports you. And so they assign me mentees who've lost their spouses to suicide. And the fact that I can get into that trench, it's all because of all this strength that I gained along the way, including at the lunatic retreat, and all of these health issues that I've had, and the losses that I've endured. There's another one I don't even mention in my bio because, of course, people have such long lists of losses. I don't need to list them all. But I had a best friend from college who passed in 2016, so a year before Glenn. And we'd been friends for 30 years, and he was really close. I mean, he was one of my table legs. He was my go-to, what do I do? I'm so confused. He always had perspective. And he died from cancer the year before Glenn died, right in the middle of our marriage. So, each of these things, you just have to keep getting up, and writing is a really helpful way to sort of crawl out of what I call the grief cave in my book about suicide loss. That's almost finished. Oh, yeah, it's gonna be done soon.
It's 13.
Yeah. And so I think that's another one of my really big lessons. So the one about empathy and responsibility for other people's feelings. And I just want to revisit that just for 1 second while I'm thinking about it. And that is, if you've done something rotten to someone, or something, your behavior hurt somebody else, that doesn't mean you don't take any responsibility, right? I didn't mean to sound like careless in that way. It means you go and apologize, and you take responsibility for your behavior, and you say, I am sorry this hurt your feelings. After that, if they decide that they're going to stay hurt, you can't do anything about it. So I think that's an important piece. I don't want to sound like I don't care about other people's feelings.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm not the cause. I can't be responsible for other people's feelings. But the other thing is, you just have to keep going. You just have to keep going. You crawl, you walk, you run, you fall down, you crawl, you walk, you run, you fall down, you write about it, you crawl, you just keep going. And honestly, through grief and loss and trauma and joy and fun and playing, life gets richer and richer.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you routed back to that, Michelle, because that a huge topic in the book writing community is the visibility conversation, right? Getting, like, taking your message and getting it out there. And I feel like I'm also writing my first book, my first installation in this series is around grief and processing grief. And so there's a whole, like, that conversation around visibility comes to a whole nother level of, you know, self-responsibility when you're writing about a topic like that and putting it out there. And I feel like I'm going to need a coaching session with you before I get that book out there.
I got you, girlfriend. I got you.
Yeah, I wondered about that, Alyssa, because of the grief conversation and yours. You know, just, I mean, between the two of you, I think everyone here has written about grief in their books, some level of it, and really losing a person quite suddenly, and then having to, you know, because I've read the scenes from both of your books, you know, and that's one of those scenes that, like, no matter how many times I read it as a coach, I'm still in tears by the end of it, you know, to the point where, you know, by, like, I don't know, edit 10, I'm like, maybe I'll just skip this part. If they didn't track any changes, I'm probably just gonna, like, take a deep breath.
Nothing new in there.
You know, but, like, how do you recommend people write through something like that? Like, what do they really need to be doing through that process that's not just the writing? Because, you know, people get into this process and they'll feel anxiety. People will get into this process and they'll feel, and sometimes continuing to write is the right answer, but sometimes there are other practices and things that have to be, you know, addressed to move some of that energy before they can actually get through the writing process without it being traumatic again. So,
Oh yeah.
what did you do? How did you manage that?
Took a lot of drugs. No, just kidding. I had stopped doing that by then. I learned a lot of in my they're still laughing. In my trauma therapy, I learned a lot about, I went through somatic sensory processing therapy. So this is Peter Levine's work. My trauma therapist was trained in that. And it was every time you start to rise, and rising, it's heart rate, it's mind, it's, you know, feeling anxiety, thinking about the thing that's troubling you, the traumatic event, or even something, you know, that might be minor. It might seem minor at the time, but if it triggers your PTSD, then it takes you back to the horror of what, you know, the original trauma. And sitting there working through those things with the somatic therapy, I was able to really stay in my body. And so it starts with connecting to your breath, and it starts with connecting to your physical body, really being very aware of your physical body. I can feel the chair beneath my body. I can see the painting up on the wall. I can hear whatever you can hear, you know, and going through your sensory experience. And then, and you, if you work with a trauma therapist, or anyone who's qualified to do this, you get a series of things, and I call it a toolbox. So in this toolbox, that's what starts my breath. It always starts with my breath. And then you go through the sensory thing. And then if that doesn't work, I move. I walk, I run, I jump. Sometimes I just bounce in place to get energy moving through my body, and then connect with nature. If I'm somewhere where I can go outside and be barefoot, I do that. Hug a tree. I'm not even kidding. Actually hug a tree, like feel the bark, put your face on the tree, all of these types of things. And then I'm a yogi, so yoga is also a respite place for me. Doing yoga and meditating, not usually the place I would go immediately if I was triggered.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just have this whole sequence, and I will share it. It's not, some of it is going to be in my suicide loss book, but I don't get graphic in that book. That's one of the things, the graphic story. So back to your question, when I was writing the story, actually bringing myself to the scene where I found Glenn's body, and how I came to the realization that he was dead, that I saw what I saw, and all of the things that happened during that time, which was only a few minutes, but in my being, it feels like days, like I was in that spot for a very long time. And in recreating that scene by writing about it, a lot of breathing, a crying. We don't give crying enough credit. People start to cry and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just falling apart. No. Crying is awesome. Crying is one of the best cleansings you can do for your mind and your emotions and even your physical body. I mean, when you cry, you release happy hormones. Your body's like, I got you, girl. I'm going to take care of you, and I mean, crying is wonderful. And when people, it happens a lot in yoga, my students will start to cry because maybe they've moved something that was stuck in their bodies. And I always encourage it. Don't apologize for crying. Let it out. This is an opportunity to process and be great, raise your resilience. Crying is wonderful. So that was another way, as I was mentioning earlier with the teardrops falling into the keyboard.
Yeah, I remember just watching you use all of your tools, noticing how you're managing your breath, how you were going outside consistently, and, moving the energy in all of those different ways. So yeah, I think
Well,
it's
and it was
really
such a beautiful space too. When I talk about being in nature as one of our big self-soothing tools, that we were in a cabin up off the Sandy River. Was it the Sandy River? And so we had this glorious place to just walk and listen to the river rolling over the rocks. And I like the beach too. I do a lot of my best writing when I can hear the ocean.
Yeah, it's interesting how like what gets connected to those flow states of like ease.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you've shared so much already today about this process. What's next for you? You're talking about this book that's coming out, and you have 3 compilation books that you're part of this last year. So tell us what helping other people with your story and message looks like from here.
Well, I want to recommend, if you sign on for compilation books or even solo books, to not have 4 come out within 12 months. I am stumbling over myself with marketing these are my 2 books that came out, this one in June, Awakening the Divine Feminine. It's all by yogis who have, again, gone through hard stuff and how the connection with the divine and yoga has helped them. And then this one just came out in September, Phoenix Rising, and it's also about going through difficult times, but not necessarily yogis. It's people in all walks of life and have gone through. And then the You Can't Make This Story Up is coming out in January. So yeah, it's a lot. And then my next book, which is really close to being completely drafted, finally, is going to be Suicide Loss, Spouse Partner Suicide Loss, A Mindful Survival Guide. And that is not the right title, but it's got all those words in it. Alyssa, you have the title.
Yeah, I think that was a really funny email exchange when I was working on the cover, and I had just put the first word that I saw in. I don't think I wrote out the original title was Suicide Loss, and I had just written suicide, and you responded and were like, I think I like that better. It was a complete accident, but I don't know what the final decision is going to be, but that was
Alyssa is working on an absolutely breathtaking cover for this book, so it'll be out soon. I'm choosing different dates, so it'll be basically what I've been talking about, the tools that I use to survive and grow, post-traumatic growth, and how I got here from there. And I have a New Year's workshop intention setting. That should be fun. Just 2 hours. I don't know if this podcast comes out after New Year's. Sorry, I'll do another one. And I'm just teaching online. I teach yoga. I teach adaptive yoga to people with mobility challenges, Parkinson's, MS, just people with sore backs, whatever. And so I'm still teaching 4 classes a week online all the way through COVID, which has been great. I do coaching, grief coaching, and wellness coaching. The wellness coaching is based in Ayurveda, which is an ancient medical practice, a sister science to yoga, all based in the rhythms of nature. It's pretty wonderful. And I do Reiki, but I haven't been doing that professionally lately, but it's kind of an everyday practice. And meditation. I teach meditation. And honestly, I'm sober. I think that's a really important thing to mention because it's something that I believe was one of my biggest helpers in surviving and thriving through trauma. Being sober, and because then you can really feel the feelings and you're not going to that glass of wine that you're always trying to numb the feelings. Because if you do that, then your process is interfered with. So, and so I'm spreading that word as well. Yeah. And I'm volunteering. I'm, very busy, but I love coaching. I love helping people learn how to bring meditation into their lives. Meditation has been just everything you've ever heard people say, oh, it was life-saving. Oh, it changed my whole life. It changed my perspective. It made it so I could lose those 50 pounds. It made it so I could get along better with my relationships, with my spouse and my children. And it's all true. Yeah. Every bit of it is true. So that's underlying every coaching session that I have, every yoga therapy session that I have, is trying to help people get meditation into their lives. Mm-hmm. I think it's the most powerful practice we can do.
Yeah, that little slice of mindfulness before we step into the story loop, right? Into the script or the behavior that's just so automatic. It's just, I love that moment when you can see it happening as it's happening. Like you work so hard for that. And then you get to that moment where you're like, oh, this is that. This is it. This is where I get to wait. What am I going to say now? Because my script that I was using at this point just doesn't work.
Right. I interrupted it with, but I think, that's another thing that I think is really good about meditation or mindfulness practices is that it connects you to the voice that you want, your true authentic self or higher self, or, instead of all those crazy voices that tell you, have that third chocolate chip cookie, you don't want to listen to that one. Right.
You have that one too?
Of course. Yeah, but I was able to silence the one that told me to continue to have a third and fourth glass of wine, so that's pretty big. And I do credit meditation with that.
Yeah. Teddy, were you going to say something?
Well, Michelle, you said something at the very beginning that I sat here and just cried. Hopefully people weren't watching me do that. But I can't even like get it back or, and it usually happens. Amanda, as my coach, knows that when I hear what I need to hear, that's hitting up against something that's not true, it goes away real quickly. And so, something that I'm dealing with right now, it's like I'm stuck in the process. And you said something, let's see if I can, you mentioned a book.
Was it David Kessler's Finding Meaning?
Finding Meaning. Could you just talk around that a little bit so I can hear what I need to hear again?
Sure. Yeah. So he actually worked with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation to add a 6th stage of grief, because the original 5 he worked with her they were originally the 5 stages of the dying. And then David worked with Elizabeth to transmute them into the 5 stages of grief. And then after, she's passed away now, but her work, is obviously timeless. And he realized after he lost his son, actually, just a few years ago, he realized at that time that there has to be a 6th stage, and that stage is finding meaning. And it doesn't mean finding meaning in the death of the person, because that's, rarely do we find meaning in that. It's the love that you had, or the works that they did while they were still alive, the beautiful things that they did, or the going forward, like for me, volunteering and writing about the loss and recovery from trauma. Not triggering, not bringing it up.
So what has come up in the last couple months is that I was bullied horribly in school. And I have a lot of tools, over the years I've, healed my life, transformed my life. I have a lot of tools. And so every tool that I go to use, I can feel the child in me resisting and saying, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to work me around this. And no, I'm not going to have it. And, but when you said something about there being meaning, like I can't see it right now, but the child in me like grabbed a hold of that, I think, like, because I have realized how in bondage and limited I am in life because of that experience, because I went from 7th grade to 12th grade just wishing to be invisible, praying to be invisible so that I could get from one class to the next without being tormented. And so that time I spent emotionally wanting to be invisible, and I'm really pretty invisible right now in my life. I mean, I'm a part of this podcast, but really in my life, I'm pretty invisible. So it's comfortable and it's safe. And I don't want to step out of that. And yet there's some very good reasons to step out of that. So I'm trying to listen to my child and honor her, where she says, don't try to manipulate. I know what you're trying to do. I know how you get around this, and I know that. I know. So don't even try it. That's what she's doing inside of me. And I feel like I need to honor that. But maybe this right here, as far as if we could find meaning in it,
Yeah,
she might feel a little bit more willing to let it go. So thank you for just sharing. That was just a sentence you did, but it hit me very deeply, and I want to thank you for that.
you're welcome. Thank you for sharing. That is an incredibly difficult time, and the fact that you're able to talk about it is really inspiring.
What, 50 years later, and it's still like, that's unbelievable. It's like, I want to be ashamed, but I'm not going to be right now.
It's totally, don't be ashamed. It's totally understandable. It's like what Amanda and I were talking about earlier. You can't look, it's so painful. You can't look at it all at once, and it takes a lot of effort. You have to actually, I had to march myself into my trauma therapist's office. And oftentimes I wanted to do anything but be there. But I was so committed to feeling better. I did not want to spend the rest of my life having these PTSD episodes where I would disembody, and they were so scary. I would actually not be where I was. My mind would leave my body, is what I experienced. And so I committed my full resources, everything I could, all of my energy, to trying to not have that experience. And it's hard. It's really hard.
Hetty, I'm so glad that you shared that because it's really funny. Sometimes I'll listen to, I'm obviously, I have my own ruts here and there that I'm trying to figure out. Sometimes certain songs will just stick and I'll just like play it over and over again for weeks at a time. And for whatever reason, Justin Bieber's Ghost of You song has been that. And I'm seeing these lyrics over and over to myself again and again, and it's all about grief and finding meaning. So it's really timely that we're having this conversation because rather than the grief I've experienced, like I'm turning 26 in a couple weeks, and I'm feeling like I'm singing it to myself. Like, I'll settle for the ghost of you, and then the rest of the lyrics and everything. It feels like this transition of saying goodbye, to an older version. And I think that the conversation around grief, just listening to Michelle talk about it today, is so endless. It's not just like we lose people and we lose versions of ourselves in millions of different ways all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that happens, whether you're writing about a grief process or not, when you commit to doing something bigger, something more, there's the death of what was. And sometimes that's extremely painful because it was really good, right? Like, you're going after that great thing, and it's really hard to let go of the good thing. And sometimes, it doesn't mean losing people. It doesn't mean, sometimes, like for me, in some cases, it's been a level of comfort, this year, deciding to grieving the days when I was just working by myself. And I don't say that to be ungrateful, but grieving days where I was less responsible, let's say, right? Like, now there's another level of responsibility and leadership required and attention, and it's part of like leaving. What, Alyssa?
I
What are you
have to.
laughing
Now
at?
you have your little sister. Now you have your little sister on your team crying every time you get out of the Zoom room because I'm lonely.
Oh,
That's what that was.
well, Amanda, you bring up a really good point about grief, and that is we connect it with loss of a human or a
Mhm.
pet, but a death. But there's really grief around so many things. If you think about it, you could grieve yesterday because that's gone, never coming back. We could grieve. There's a collective grief happening because of COVID, life before COVID, and we all expected to be back to our regular everyday programming by now. And we're almost 2 years into this thing, and
Yeah.
we're still not able, we're just not back to how it was before COVID. And so there's a lot of grief in just living right now for every human on the planet.
Mhm.
And so I think that we don't give enough credit to the fact that we do have grief in our lives a lot more often than we realize.
And I'm so glad that you guys brought that up because for me, I'm watching my dad go through Alzheimer's and the change in him the last 6 months. And it really hit me hard last week. How do I communicate? He has no idea who I am. Can't really talk to him on the phone. So I'm grieving that. So I appreciated you being on and talking about grief, and I took it in a totally different direction because I haven't lost him yet, and yet I have.
Yeah, we actually talked about Alzheimer's and some other degenerative diseases in my grief educator program, because it's true. You grieve. You've lost something. The person, the body is still walking around, talking, breathing, existing, but all the memories are lost. All that connection, your relationship is now in a different place than it was before. and it's not going to go back. So it is a loss that needs to be honored and grieved. It's
Do
yeah.
you find that ever correlates with the I'm not being seen? Because you've lost that. I know that's what I was going through, is that whole thing of nobody seeing me, and I was having experiences that just amplified that, you know.
Mhm.
And when I finally connected it to that loss with my dad, that's when everything finally fell into place for me and finally made sense. I didn't know if that was something you guys talked about in your counseling class, but that's what worked for me, was recognizing that I was having those feelings because of that loss.
Absolutely. That's number one. When you're in acute grief, people, grief educator, grief coach now, what can you do for someone who's in acute grief? Sometimes you're not ready for these tools yet. You can't tell someone who's sobbing to take a deep breath. They're sobbing. That's the only breathing they can do right now. So the only thing you can offer at that time is witnessing, which to bring us full circle, right? That's what Amanda does. That's what writing our stories does. Witnessing. Amanda just texted me the other day. I was thanking her for something, and she said, it's been an honor witnessing your journey. And that's what we can do for people who are in acute grief. You just have to be there and witness what they're going through and offer your support. So witnessing your own, Lori, in that case, I think it's really important for you. And, maybe hopefully you have a good therapist. It's really, really drastically important for you to understand that you are going through a grieving process. Even though your dad is still alive, there's loss there.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry.
Yeah. Really important conversation. Our culture is so
Grief illiterate.
illiterate, and not just grief, because there's this other piece too that occurs to me when I talk about grief, and that is how disconnected we are from seasons,
Yeah.
and nature, right? Because we kind of, if we were connected, we would see the circle of life, right? We would
Yeah.
see the notice that everything has a birth and a death and things that happen in between. And yet, because we're not attuned to that from a very young age, we miss out on that process of learning how to grieve and recognizing that actually this is just part of life.
Right.
You're going to
The
have
life
pets.
cycle.
You're going to have pets and they're not going to last as long as you. You're going to have jobs and they're not going to last forever. You're going to have relationships and friendships will end. Like, to me, it's such an essential part of our humanity that is like never addressed until someone is smack in the middle of it. It's
Right. And by then
making to me.
You're asking someone to run a marathon when they can't even walk a block. I mean, we don't have the
Right.
training or the cultural support or the tools built in from childhood. We're learning our ABCs and how to add and subtract, but we're not learning emotional intelligence, or emotional resilience. And it is part of nature. And, that's one of the things I love about yoga and Ayurveda is it's all about that. It's the growth, it's the support, and it's the destruction, the three parts of life, the loss, birth, life, death. And it's a natural process. And that's how Ayurveda thinks of it. And the same thing with connecting to nature. It's all based in natural rhythms and nature being the ruling force. And I don't think we should go down this tangent right now, but I think a big part of the problem with our world right now is that we're completely disconnected from nature and not respecting nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, even
Start the
bef-
next 3 hours of the podcast.
on that note. Oh, well, I know we are out of time, and I know that we probably should do another podcast on diving a little bit deeper into this, because, we're talking about your story, but I do think it's absolutely important and critical that we start getting this conversation into the world, in a prevention sort of manner, in a like, this is part of life, and let's just, there's only so much that you can learn before you're in the middle of it, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's all mental until it has to be physical, but at least if it's there, you can grab it for it in the moment when you need it. And so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important. I mean, until you go through something, like until I lost uh Glenn, until I lost my mom, there's no way I could have prepared.
Mhm.
But knowing, being more consistently aware of and accepting of loss in general would have made these things easier.
Mhm. Yeah, and all of the practices that you have, and understanding the biology that, and that we have a certain amount of control over it, is everything in a moment where things are spinning out of control around.
Yeah.
So, any final thoughts that you want to share with our listeners, Michelle?
Oh, I think I said a lot. I think I'm good. Just, I guess just keep going. There's an answer. There's an answer to healing your pain if you just devote yourself to it. You can heal. You can write that story. Maybe the two are connected, but just keep going. Just keep trying. You will find a resource. You will find a way to get through it, and then you'll be stronger.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for being here today and sharing your story and your wisdom. And thanks all of you for playing and making sure that we took that in all the directions it wanted to go for this time. And I want to
Well,
thank.
thanks for having me. I enjoy your podcast.
Where can we find her if we want to connect?
Yes. How can people find you?
Oh, yeah, just go to my website. It's inhabitjoy.com, and everything's there, and it's absolutely gorgeous. Thanks to Alyssa. My website looks amazing. But I have, Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and all of that, but it's easiest. All the resources are on the website. So you can go there and sign up for my email list and sign up for holiday specials depending. I should have asked you when this podcast was coming out, but all of my offerings are beautifully displayed thanks to Alyssa on my website. So you can find it inhabitjoy.com.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Sips of Story and Sanity. If you like what you heard, and I can't imagine you wouldn't have, I hope you'll consider subscribing and maybe even sharing a review or something that you're taking away from this podcast and kind of tucking away for that moment when you need it. You can also find out more details about our upcoming book, collaborative book, You Can't Make This Story Up. What if it's all happening for us, that Michelle has told her story in, at truetointention.com. That's it for today. Thanks, ladies.
Thanks, everyone.